Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. So once again, my name is Eric Jara, Chapter President of Hacemos Dallas, and I just want to thank you all very much for being here on Indigenous Peoples Day for a very special session of Latino Talks. I'm going to hand it off to Jose Rodriguez, who is our VP of Operations at Hacemos Dallas, to go ahead and kick off our meeting. Jose?
Thank you, Eric. Again, welcome. My name is Jose Rodriguez. I'm the VP of Hacemos Dallas. Thank you for joining us today for our special Latino Talks, as we are partnering with ICAA to talk about a connection between Latinos, American Indians, and the Indigenous people. With me as a co-moderator is Jessica McKinney with ICAE Texas. So, Ms. Jessica, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jose and Hacemos, for partnering with us on this topic. For those not familiar with IK, we're the Intertribal Council of AT&T employees. Today we have a esteemed panelist, and I'll go ahead and introduce them on this Indigenous Peoples Day. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, everyone. First, we'll hear from Tracy Miranda Hess, National Secretary of IK. We'll also hear from Peggy Larney, full-blooded American Indian from the Choctaw Nation and founder of the American Indian Heritage Day in Texas. Then we'll hear from Brian Larney, full-blooded American Indian from the Choctaw and Seminole Nations and CEO of the American Indian Heritage Day in Texas.
With that, we will have a question and answer session. So please type any questions you have, comments in the chat box. So let's get started. Tracy, please tell us about the intersection between Spain and the Indigenous people of the Caribbean.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Jose, and thank you, everybody, for having me. Before we get started, I'd first like to begin with a land acknowledgement. This is a practice that is commonplace all over the world, and some have even made it policy to open events and gatherings by first acknowledging the traditional Indigenous inhabitants of the land. While some institutions of the United States have adopted this as a custom, the majority do not. Our hope is that this will one day become commonplace across the United States. So with that, if we could go to the map. Thank you. So this map very loosely identifies some of the traditional stewards of the lands that we now reside on. So I'd like to stop for a moment to acknowledge them, and especially their ancestors, descendants, and all Indigenous people who live now and have ever lived in our regions of Turtle Island. Thank you. If we can go to the next slide. My name is Tracy Miranda Hess, and I am the National Secretary for IK. I am also the Secretary for the Keepers of the Eastern Flame, which is the Northeast region and the Caribbean. I am a member of both IK and Hacemos, as well as 4 other employee groups. And every employee group has a lot to offer, so I encourage everyone to join multiple employee groups, especially ones that are different from you, so that you can learn more about the diversity that is within AT&T. I identify as Indigenous Latinx from the Caribbean. My ancestors were born on an island that is currently known as Puerto Rico, but its original name was Borinquen, which is where we get our modern word Boricua. It's a derivative from that original language. This is what we called ourselves long before Columbus was lost at sea. And we can't really talk about Indigenous people from the Caribbean without first talking about Columbus. He made first contact with Indigenous people in the Caribbean in 1492. Can you please go to the Columbus slide? Though Columbus was Italian, he was sent by Spain with a Spanish fleet to find new trade routes to India. Because he refused to admit that he was lost and nowhere near India, he declared that the millions of people already living in the Caribbean must be Indians. And so this started the longest standing cover-up in history. How many know that if you tell a lie for long enough, people begin to accept it as truth? And this lie is the reason why even today, Indigenous people in North and South America are referred to as Indians. In Puerto Rico specifically, Columbus called us Taino Indians. Taino was actually a town in Italy, and it had really nothing to do with the Indigenous people who lived there. He did this for 2 reasons. The first was to hide that he was not a very good navigator and that he didn't know where he was or who the people was living there. So he started to wipe away the language and the culture of indigenous Caribbeans. And he did this in an effort to enslave and torture them. He thought there was a considerable amount of gold in Puerto Rico, but there really wasn't. And so all of those people were enslaved and tortured in vain because there wasn't much for them to find and to give to Columbus. After this call, you're going to receive some resources. One of those resources is a link to the journals that Columbus kept, and you can read about it in his own words. He wrote in horrifying detail about how he enslaved and tortured Caribbean indigenous people. And when you read it in his own words, you can begin to understand why Columbus statues are being toppled around the world. Before we can go any further, I have to stop for a moment to thank our indigenous cousins across the country who have fought on our behalf to reclaim October 12th for Indigenous Peoples Day. And I have the great honor of speaking alongside two of them who you will hear on this panel very shortly. Many Caribbean indigenous people, both in the islands and in the diaspora, also celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day of Remembrance. This is the Sunday before the 12th. This is actually a day of mourning. This is when we remember our ancestors who suffered at the hands of Columbus. We use this time to remember our cousin tribes in North and South America who have also suffered at the hands of colonizers. And we continue to mourn the untold number of missing and murdered indigenous women who were stolen every year at a rate 10 times higher than other women and girls. If we can go to the next slide. This is a snippet from a map that I will send you the link to, and this map shows where all of the indigenous people that we're aware of, where they originally came from. And so in this case, for Caribbean indigenous people, who Columbus called Taino, those people lived on the tip of Florida, all through the Florida Keys. They lived in the Bahamas, the West Indies, the Virgin Islands. You could find them in Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cayman Islands, and even the eastern tip of Venezuela. You could also find them through, around the edge of Venezuela, but the largest population of Tainos lived at the edge, at the tip of Venezuela. Everything that you see on this map represents areas that Spain colonized, and it represents many millions of people, some of which were enslaved and tortured, as my ancestors were. Before Columbus, these people would have called themselves by their indigenous names. So in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned, is Borinquen, but since Columbus, we'll say Taino Borinquen because Taino is the name that some people will recognize us by. In the Bahamas, you'll see that they call themselves Taino Lucayo, and then down on the bottom is the Taino Kalinago people. Something that's interesting of note is that National Geographic did a human genome project where they compared ancient Taino DNA in the Bahamas with modern Puerto Rican people living today. And what they found is that the DNA had so many similarities that they had a common ancestor. Likewise, they compared modern Puerto Ricans, not just people who identified as Taino, but just the general population. They compared their DNA with the Clovis baby who was found in Clovis, Montana. He was an indigenous baby, and they compared it to his DNA, and again, they found that there was a common ancestor. So this really rings true for us at IK because our motto is that we are all related, and at least for the Caribbean people, we have evidence to show that this is true of us. And again, I will send the link out to this map, and I encourage you to put into the map wherever your ancestors came in, either recent or distant, and it'll show you who the indigenous people were who lived there, and some of them may be your ancestors.
Thank you, Tracy. That's such great insight to know where you came from. Thanks for sharing.
Yep, we have just a few more slides. So then the question is, what remains of indigenous Caribbeans, and where is the intersection with Spanish culture? So first we'll talk about art and language. As far as art, we can see that in the petroglyphs that exist, which are carvings in stone. These stones would appear in a circle called a bate, and a bate was a gathering place where they would meet for meals, they would meet to play games, and of all the petroglyphs, in Puerto Rico, the one that's the most famous is the one in the center. This is actually a painting of a coquí. You will find the coquí in art, you'll find it in clothing, on jewelry, even to this day throughout Puerto Rico. There is even a story that is passed down to children about the last chief who fell to the conquistadors. And the story says that chief's name was Coquí, and that when he died at the hand of the conquistadors, that the frogs started to say his name, Coquí, Coquí, and the story is that they will continue to say his name until he returns. And anybody who's ever visited Puerto Rico knows that sound very distinctively of the Coquí. We call it their song, and when we leave the islands, people will come back and they'll say that it's the sweetest sound that they have ever heard because they know that they are home. As far as language, we've retained about 1,000 words and in Puerto Rico, but throughout the Caribbean, there are more words and there's a lot of grammar that's been retained. And so a lot of linguistics and a lot of anthropologists have been working to reconstruct the language in this area. Some of these words have even made their way into English, like the word barbacoa, which means barbecue, hamaca, which means hammock, huracán, which means hurricane. And in one of the links I'll send out is Dr. Melendez, who is the director of the Naguaque community, and she was speaking at the Smithsonian talking about the effort to reclaim lost language and culture. So when we talk about food and music, this is really where we get more into the intersection of Hispanic culture and indigenous culture. So on the bottom of this slide, there's food there that in Puerto Rico we call pasteles, but our ancestors would have called it jayaques. And the outside is a Caribbean potato, and then the inside today is pork. Pork was brought to the island by the Spaniards, and it's a big part of food in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Our ancestors, though, would have had this filled with fish, and this would be wrapped in a banana leaf. Today it's boiled, but our ancestors would have cooked it on the barbacoa, which we now know is the barbecue. You'll find versions of this dish throughout South America and parts of North America where it has many different names. When it comes to music, the intersection really it can be easily seen when you talk about son, bomba, and plena. These types of musics are right at the intersection of Spanish guitar with indigenous percussion, and it's really evident there. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk just a little bit about the Taino movement. I'm going to send out resources about this, so I'll just generally say that today there are thousands of people in the Caribbean who identify as Taino, and they gather in communities called yucayeques, which just means villages. There is no formal Taino membership, and there is no formal Taino nation. It's more of a relationship type of membership where once you take interest in a community and they begin to get to know you, they will eventually call you as their own. I'm connected with the Naguaque community in Puerto Rico, and as I mentioned, you can catch a video that the director did at the Smithsonian. And then here in my area, in the Northeast region, I'm connected with the Arayeque community, and I'll send a link out to a page that they have where you can, that is an educational page to learn more about indigenous Caribbeans. And then this last slide is just a slide of resources. And we'll send this out to anyone. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and then we'll answer them during the Q&A section. So with that, I'll give it back to Jessica and Jose.
Thank you, Tracy. That was very informative. I think next we have Peggy Larney. Thanks to the efforts of Peggy over the last few years, more local governments are recognizing today as Indigenous Peoples Day. Tell us about the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution in Dallas, Peggy. Peggy, are you there?
T.
There you are.
In 2018 was our first year. It was quick and briefly, and it was handed to us in the back room of the council chamber room. Last year, 2019, community people came out to support the resolution, passing of the resolution. However, we were forced to listen to one of the council person who identified himself as Cherokee Indian, but he didn't really support our resolution. He was more resistance because we were making Columbus the evil person, and he didn't like that. And so we had to change. The council had to have 2-3 meetings to reword until we were, as a community, satisfied with what they had come up with. And so we did. We wanted the passage of the resolution, so we did accept a couple of places where it made Columbus not as bad as we had originally started with. Well, this year I have the signed resolution in front of me that was just presented to our Indian community at noontime today. And this was given to me, so it's signed by the current mayor. Did you know also today there's a presidential proclamation for Columbus Day? Go to whitehouse.government and see what it says. It kind of forces our, as he calls, activists, people that are against Columbus, people that are against monuments, and various things. He spells it out in this presidential proclamation. And it makes you wonder, should he have done that? But what does he care? He does whatever he wants to. So he puts all of this into a presidential proclamation. Then he in turn said he is addressing the monuments, making it people that's going to get caught destroying a monument. Anybody, any monument, especially Christopher Columbus, going to get punished. Then he also goes and says that anybody that is defacing, having protest, he's going to. He's already has something in place. This was all in the proclamation, Christopher Columbus, and so it makes you wonder why even have that, because it was just basic what I'm afraid that our current president wants to say. Well, let me tell you about the Indigenous People Day. It started in 1980 in South Dakota. And then that day, it was going to be the second Monday in October, and it was called Native American Day. But it did change a little bit later. And then Berkeley, California, the college there was also very instrumental in pushing the signing of resolution because it was going to be the 200th anniversary of the Christopher Columbus. And at that time, back in the 1980s, when 88 to 90, when United Nations knew that this was going to happen for the celebration of Christopher Columbus, at that time, the people of the United Nations had already started working to not let this happen because of what we today know, that Christopher Columbus didn't even step 1 foot in our land, but people giving him that kind of credit. And so with that, Berkeley, California had a coinciding signing of a resolution in reference to the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus. 2 years later, at Santa Cruz, California, which started the holiday, instituted the holiday in the 20th to 2010, and various other cities. We are also in that now, having our own resolution. So this time we have, and so in 1990 was the United Nations that really helped with the definition of indigenous people and with the awareness of the upcoming Christopher Columbus. Let me tell you the definition of indigenous? 'Cause that's probably going to be one of the questions. What is indigenous? We heard Tracy talking about indigenous people. We hear indigenous people referred to everybody. To me, I have two, three different types of uh, my perspective of definition, and it is that when I say indigenous people, I'm referring to the American Indians who inhabited this land. I will accept that as indigenous people. Now, it's been lately popular to claim all brown skins to be indigenous. Well, everybody's indigenous to the land that they're supposed to be born at, but if you weren't born there, you're here in the United States. Of course, back in the before there was even any boundaries, the Mexican Indians, the Mexicans, and his were all over in Texas area, as well as a lot of the Indian tribes, and so there was no filter or no definition of who is who. Then the United States government comes in and places a boundary and forces the people there. Either you stay here or you go back to Mexico. Those that were aligned with tribal people because they were of the tribes, they stayed and became citizens of that tribe. Others went to Mexico and now they're Mexicans. With those Indians that stayed, we became a federally recognized tribe. Most of us are federally recognized tribe. But our people had to go through the DOS rolls, which is given the roll number to the enrollee person, and then from there, each generation would have to enroll with the tribal enrollment agency using the original DOS rolls. And so I can sit here with my card that says I'm a full-blood American Indian because I have Dawes Rose number of my father and of my grandmother. Those two were original enrollees of the Dawes Road. However, and so, if with my granddaughter and her daughter, my great granddaughter, they're all already enrolled with the Choctaw Nation because they can use my daddy's roll number. Unless you can do that, you can't really officially claim yourself as American Indian. You can be born as American Indian. You have a choice. If you want to, you do enroll with your tribe. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You don't have to go through the process. And then that means that you don't get any of the benefit as a tribal member. But you do have that choice. We have people that are married into the Indian tribe, but that doesn't make you an Indian. Only the child that comes from this relationship has the legal right and a choice to make whether they want to be Indian or not Indian. And that's usually made by the mother or father that is the enrolled Indians. So it makes it a little bit more difficult when we start talking about indigenous. We know as American Indians that we have to jump the hoop to be classified as and memorized and finally getting a citizenship to our tribal nation to be American Indians. Nobody else does that. We have, especially in South Texas, we have tribes, people now saying that they're American Indians and trying to get a state recognized. One tribe, the Lipan Apaches, got a state recognized tribe, but they're trying to get a federally recognized tribe and having a hard time. There's others that have said they're part American Indian tribe, but whether they are not, they're not federally recognized. So it makes it difficult because it seems like that nowadays everybody's always wanted to be American Indians, and we have had false organizations, false entity claiming to be American Indian entities because they can get benefits or they can sell for immigration cards at a cheap price and try to bring the immigration the illegal way. And so that makes it hard when we start talking about indigenous, who is really the indigenous people. It's something that I think the word has become popular within the past 10 years. Why is that so? And so I was, I guess the separation that the United States government had done upon us brown skins has made it very, very difficult. And of course, that's what they had wanted. And then we have at a point of time to now that we have racial healing, which is I want to say that a lot of us that lives in Dallas, we're called the urban Indians because we don't go back to our homeland and we don't go back to our tribal land and actively engage in the activities. Many still do, but a lot of us don't. That were into third and fourth generation. We came here in 1950 because of the relocation program. That was one way of the United States government to do another genocide on our people, bring them into the cities, make them sacrifice. A lot of our people couldn't handle uh, the culture shock. And so they went home. Those that stayed couldn't handle culture shock and had faced many, many problems and eventually had to go home. Those of us that stayed, we had to develop our own American Indian Community Center, a place where the Indians can come meet. My husband and I were part of that. We was a young adult church from the Dallas Indian United Methodist Church that partnered with the Spring Valley United Methodist Church in this endeavor. And within the third, fourth time that we had a meeting, the community came saying, this is what we've been looking for many, many years. So they took over and made the American Indian Center into an actual reality. And they existed for many, many years and finally became inactive because of poor leadership. We also, at that time, through our church, saw the need and had started medical facilities and dental facilities. A little bit later, the community, in addition with our church members, started the, at that time, it's called Dallas Indian Christian Center. It was housed by volunteer doctors, and eventually our church released the dental assistants and the medical assistants that we had started to the urban, what became Dallas Intertribal Center. Later on, that name was changed to where today it is recognized as the Urban Intertribal Center of Texas. And so we have many, many uh, applications that we we can share with you in reference to the Dallas community coming together. The reason that we have reached out to the Dallas to the AATT partnership with under this Indigenous movement is because today is Indigenous Peoples Day. It seems like it's just only Indians there. If we're going to be in saying indigenous, where's the other indigenous people? They should be invited. They should feel like that they're included. So this is the talk that I want y'all to have as far as this conversation. When we say indigenous people, who does that relate to? Does it mean just only American Indians, or does it mean other indigenous people? If we're going to have a broad definition to indigenous people, well, it should include all people. The American Indian Heritage Day is the last Friday in September, designated by the state law. On this day, school, businesses, organizations are encouraged to to educate their people about the many historical, cultural, and social contributions that the American Indian community and leaders have made. The mission statement is that we are to make people aware, to educate, and or advocate for American Indian heritage and culture to all people. This is where our call of action is coming. We look at the resolution and we need to revise it if it does include all indigenous people. If we're going to say in Dallas we need to have all indigenous people, and we've got a lot of indigenous people that could be part of this day. We have been, that's one call. Then the second call to nation is that to support the American Indian on Indigenous Day, which would have all the indigenous people to, if we stay true to the definition. But it's up to you throughout the nation, national ACC, ATT, uh, indigenous groups to talk and to start. If you're close to an Indian reservation, reach out to them, see what you can do. If you're close to an Indian entities, organizations, reach out to them, see what y'all can do in partnershiping at your place and have an Indigenous Day. And so I think that kind of does all of my presentation, and I'll be around for questions and answers. But I do thank you for listening to me. As you notice that I am full-blood American Indian. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, but I've lived in the Dallas area since 1963, and so I was here at the beginning of the beginning of the Indian American Indian community. Another question is probably going to be asked why I keep saying American Indian instead of Native American. I use American Indian because my generation came up with that word, and we use it in, and if you notice, all documentation that comes from government up to just real recently, it's always been American Indian slash Alaskan Natives. And it's always when they're listing all the federally recognized tribes, there's over 469, I think it's 475, if I'm not wrong, a federally recognized tribe today. They're listed in the Federal Register under American Indian tribes, not Native American, but under Native American. And Native American is a political word that came into effect about 20 years ago as they were put hyphenating with other ethnicity. And so we became Native American. But I hear so much people say, well, I'm born in South America. That makes me Native American. Uh, those that are not American Indians, but are that lives in the United States and born in the United States also come back with, well, I'm born in North America, so I'm Native American too. Well, there goes the definition, if however you want to play with it. But the popular terminology right now has been Native American, but most of it kind of accepted. And of course, some of them goes with Native, some goes with Indians, some goes with whatever terminology is more popular and acceptable in their region of the state. So that's my contribution why I use American Indian instead of Native American. So with my tribal language, Yakaki, thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Yakaki.
Yeah, hi, how you
Thank you so
doing
much,
today?
Peggy. I was just going to give you an introduction, Brian.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for that. And we're going to turn it over to Brian Larney. Tell us about American Indian Latino connection and identity.
Thank you, Rachel. Want to say thank you to AT&T and all the participants that are here today to take time out of your busy schedule for an educational value. Then also on this day, kind of learn a little bit more of the interior parts from the Latin community, then also the American Indian community too. What we're trying to do is give a broader perspective. And so my name is Brian Larney, Seminole Choctaw. I'm chair for American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, and our mission for AIHD is cultural preservation and education. Also, I'm chair for Indian Citizens Against Racial Exploitation, which is taking on the tougher topics. So, we're taking on the major one we're taking on is American Indian racist mascots. So I want to give the introduction and also, that our organization on the last Friday in September has a state law called American Indian Heritage Day. That we grew from actually a grassroots organization. So that's how we were developed. So I want to say thank you for the introduction, but also thank you for being here. Wanted to push first that we're honoring the ancestors of the Saboni, the Arawak, and the Carib people from the Caribbean islands. To me, this is not a day of celebration. This is a day of honoring our ancestors. And on this part, this is where we need to make sure that there are voices that you cannot hear anymore. There are generations that have been torn apart. There's been matrilineal um, teachings that are now gone forever. And so, on that part, when your numbers were so great and then get reduced by genocide and then also the after effects of historical trauma, what is your cultural preservation after? What is your knowledge of everyday life or the legacy of your people? How do you hear different pieces that makes you more affluent to who you are as as you as your identity? It's either American Indian or Latin, and so that's the part where that needs to be pushed out today is that there's similarities, but also there's defining moments of separation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But also, I'm not sure if there's a lot of Italians participants, descendants that are here also. But as American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, when I mentioned that this is not a day of celebration, but the day of remembrance, I want to make sure that everybody knows that AIHD is important. It's supporting the movement where we can actually create an Italian day and holidays more specific to the Italians because I understand that they felt like Columbus Day was ripped apart from them. But the only thing that's ripped away from them is the truth of genocide and the hierarchy who pushed this to be what is now known in history books. The other part is also that with the truth being pushed a little bit more, now we can start looking at readdressing the history books. We can start changing the narrative. We can also push the collective thought to the right people who needs healing. And on that part, I think those are the approaches that those voices that were here that are gone now. That's the part we need to make sure that we honor them in different movements that we approach. So, wanted to say thank you to everybody for being here. On this day, this is how our government looked upon us and labeled us as becoming we speak the truth in civil rights to dismantle ideologies and persuaded marketing as a symbol of discovery from a manipulated context for our future, forced to reinforce this is stolen land in a mental and physical state of mind. The hardest part on this one is that this is more directed to your history books. This is why a lot of knowledge, this is why we're here talking. This is why you're listening to Tracy to speak truth about the people, about the islands, to know what Columbus did, why he didn't. The other part is that, for American Indians, he never came to the to our part of the land. There was no 1492 because everything he did in the genocide was down in the Caribbean islands. And so in that part, that's where I need to make sure on our side that we know the truth on our side, but we need to honor also. And so even with that part, you're going to hear Native American Heritage Month, which is supposed to be honoring us. But take time, and if you can go on American Indian Heritage Day in Texas on Facebook, you'll see a truth. You'll see a part now that we're not honored, that now I'm be called a radical activist. So I am your radical. I am your radical activist. I am your American Indian. I am your Seminole Choctaw, because in what the 45th president had wrote, he's labeling American Indians as radical activists because we want that change of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So even in truth serums, it's not even taken taken or approved, or even the perception of approval to honor the right perception of history books. And so that's why, well, what I'm speaking about is healing sacred voices. The other part is that you have to understand that our ancestors are beginning to speak again. We're the tools for that messaging to come out. The part where you asked us what is the connection between the Latin community and also the American Indian community, our communication is genocide and historical trauma. Our, the connections are comes they lead they comes from the strategy, tactful funding, countries that wanted to invade under conquest, but also to take away to take and own land and also steal our resources. The other part is that we exist of connected histories through our tradition, understanding the four elements of life and our medicine. Our parts where we look at our connectivity is our deep roots of our people. And that's the part where I ask, if I'm talking to another Latino, I ask you if you're Aztec or Mayan. I'm trying to reach the deep roots of your people. Also to know if your people come from the more the rivers, more waterfalls, or also the ranch styles, or even the mountains, because everything that we are targeted as far as our identity is connected through our geographical state from Mother Earth. And the hardest part is that a lot of people don't know that our rivers are a key. The rivers are the veins of Mother Earth. We find our we're able to find our medicine, our roots, our healing purposes. We're able to look at and build irrigation systems that self sustain also. But in the way of our life is that you're able to grow, you're able to be taught how to heal, you're able to also nourish yourself with water, and our bodies are 90% water. So in that part, that's where even in the deepest root of who is who or what is what, you find that old culture that's present. You find you people walk in because the legacy of their DNA makes them move in momentum toward toward what is they take for granted, and they don't know that it's a process from our ancestors. And the part that I really got to see a connection is when I was able to meet I was even able to meet a medicine man from the Totem people, and he was actually able to live in Mexico by the ruins. I think the best part is that he had heard we're American Indian. He didn't know that my legacy comes from medicine man. And the other part is that when we spoke, it was two heritages, two traditions, two ethnicities meeting together, and from there you start to look at what is the part of how our cultures have never met, but we get the same similarities. Our my people are southeastern people, so totem people have ruins. Our people, the southeastern American Indians, have mounds. Both of them honor, the death of our ancestors, and so there's a lot of, similarity in why those are built, but also those are cornerstones of our civilization during those time periods. The other part is that when we spoke about different roots. We spoke about how things heal. We looked at our culture. Everything was very similar. And it's kind of what today's are. Our dialects are the strength of who we are. Our legacy are found in our artwork, our sculptures, how we approach even or the dressing of what normal day wear is today, or even to the regalia that are seen in ceremonial events. Those are the hard part that people overlooked, and even then, to go outside of our circle, that even to make a little more stronger ripples, is that I do ask all the Europeans talk, if you're going to meet American Indians or the Latino community in the future, tell them who you are. Don't tell them you're a patriot. Don't tell me you're white or you're Caucasian, because your bloodlines come deeper from across the water. And even in the old photos, when everybody came across the Ellis Island and saw the Statue of Liberty, everybody back then had their traditional garments on. You knew who was from who and what country they came from. But because of that, that's where the American dream has pushed, where everybody changed their name, changed their narrative, looked to ways how they can blend in. But at the same time, is that for our people, our strength is our cultural preservation. It's our identity of how we look. It's how we present. Even the accents of our dialects is a strength of us. And even within those sacred voices that we push are those elements of oral teachings. True, we don't have storybooks. We don't have monuments everywhere. We did our artwork on the side of mountains. We did our storytelling passed on about the creation of Mother Earth through storytelling from our elders. Those are the parts that you need to look at, that for us is that there's a breakaway from what is indigenous and what is native. When people describe genocide in the Caribbean and use word natives, they assume or clump our people together. In our history, or to eliminate, we lose our cultural preservation that has to be told from our relatives and not from the classroom history. So history books, and there's a lot of ignorance that either you look at ignorance or you look at blurred education. Do you look at it that it's overlooked, or is it pushed by prejudice, stereotypes, or racism that follow a new narrative in school systems, or different other parts that it may come from missionaries of churches from Western civilizations? Or do you look at it through the other part, is that, or is it, do you see that that it's being taught as campaigns to erase our identity? And so even the melting pot may get where people lose their identity only to fit in. And I think those are the other parts. So even at the last part, I want to make sure that our identification, to reinforce what I was saying today, it's our stories, our music, our food, and especially our people. So I want to say thank you today.
Brian,
So much.
Tracy, yeah, Peggy, thank you so much for, the conversations and the information as well too. I know I'm over here taking notes, thinking about what I can do to kind of research for my own family as well too. So in the comments as well too, as people have been throwing in a couple of questions, a couple of things I just wanted to highlight. First, thank you from some of our audience who says they learned a lot, very talented presenters. Also, an additional statement as well too from someone in the audience that says, "I am from Puerto Rico," so related to Tracy's presentation. They did their ancestry and found they're 20% Native American. So they have more of a comment than a question, because their ancestors were slaughtered and no tribe was left. They lost the right to call themselves Indigenous people. So, definitely a lot of reflection on what was shared in the conversations. So at this point, I know we have about 9 minutes left. We'll continue to open it up for Q&A. So feel free to type in those questions in the chat. I would like to start with a question specifically for Brian and for Tracy. So in many cities, Latinos and American Indian communities support each other on issues of race, discrimination, and justice. So what are the common struggles that Latinos and American Indians face now and in the past, which brings them together? So we'll start with Tracy, and then we'll go to Brian.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for that question. I would say that there's a lot of social justice issues that are common to most minorities. And for Indigenous people, that history of social justice issues goes back several hundred years. And so there's been a lot of collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous minorities who suffer similar injustices to work together to advocate in the law, advocate in corporate environments for to make sure that everybody is treated equally and fairly. In 2021, IK is going to be doing a whole series on Indigenous identity. And especially during Native American Heritage Month, Les Fry, who is on the call, is going to be leading a series of talks, and a number of those are going to touch on justice issues for Indigenous, Latinx, and Afro-Indigenous, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. I think if anybody'd like to participate in those, I think at the end, Jess is going to tell you how you can get on our mailing list so you can participate in some of those talks. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Brian, any comments?
I think for us, and I think it's very true with what y'all are practicing right now, is racial equity and racial equality. I think that our voice is being heard now, but at the same time is that it can never be heard about 40 years ago. At the same time is that solidarity and unity needs to be practiced because the events will happen in Puerto Rico, that we need to make sure that we have that network where we stand up for each other and we back each other up. The last part is that, even with that part, is that our youth needs to understand our cultural preservation, because in some kind of term, they need to be our activists, educators, artists, or teachers for our future. And they're going to be taking the next generation mantle. So they need to make sure that they understand or be prepared, because they will have to pass it on as they grow also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Brian. Next question would be open to anyone. So what are some resources that Latinos and Hispanics can use to find or trace their Indigenous heritage and roots?
This is Tracy. I am a genetic genealogist in my spare time, and so this is a question that I field quite often. I actually did a talk on Indigenous genealogy and ancestry, and probably there's two best resources that you can do. One of them is definitely do a DNA test, not because that will associate you with a tribe, but because it'll help you identify who you're connected to genetically. So for instance, mine showed a large amount of Indigenous DNA, and that was able to connect me with a cousin who was active in the Indigenous community. And so I was able to learn a lot from him and figure out who the ancestors I had that were connected to that nation. Then you have to back it up with a paper trail. The DNA is just a hint. And so the paper trail is just good old-fashioned research. And so there's free resources on familysearch.org, or if paid resources through ancestry.com to help you with that. And if anyone's interested in it, I can reach out to them offline and give you some more help with it.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Tracy. Any additional comments from our panelists? All right, so then with that, I believe now we are going to go ahead and turn it back over to Jessica and Jose for some closing remarks.
Absolutely. So you can find IK on Facebook as well as IK_national on Twitter and Instagram. So if you want more information about reaching out to us, see us on the social media. Don't forget to visit our virtual booth at the EG conference, which is actually this Friday. It's crazy how time's flying. But and staying tuned, just like Tracy mentioned, we have a full calendar of events for Native American Heritage Month next month, which is November, which will be here before we know it. So more to come in our social media. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jessica. Jose?
Again, we'd like to thank everybody who joined. This is a great resource that we were given the opportunity to learn. Just a little bit, just, if you catch just a tad bit, there is a lot that we are in common. One of our greatest sayings here, and hacemos is, juntos hacemos más, and that can't be truer with not only the CG group, but with all of them. Together we make a greater impact in our community. Again, want to share that we will be at our EG conference as well. Please come and join us. And this video recording will also be part of that. So again, thank you so much.
Jose, thank you very much. So on that, I believe we're going to go to closing comments. So I'll just open it up one last time for our panelists or anybody else before we end the recording for today. So any additional comments from the group? All right, so on that note, on behalf of Hacemos and IK and all our panelists, thank you very much for joining today. It was a pleasure to have this conversation. Brian, Tracy, Peggy, thank you very much for sharing everything today. And hope you all have enjoy the rest of your week. And thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.